He thought humiliating her would be easy, just another quiet face to remind everyone who was in charge, but in less than a minute, that assumption would cost him everything he had built in that room. The glass-walled boardroom on the 32nd floor shimmered under the midday Manhattan sun, reflections of tailored suits and polished shoes stretching across the long marble table where decisions worth millions were made without hesitation. And at the far end sat Clara Whitman, barely noticed. A temporary assistant filling in for someone no one bothered to remember, her gray cardigan soft against the sharp edges of a room designed for power, her presence quiet, almost invisible, exactly how they preferred it. Ethan Caldwell stood at the head of the table, his navy suit flawless, his confidence practiced, a man who had spent years building authority not just through results but through control, through moments like this. Moments where he reminded everyone that he saw everything and missed nothing, or at least that's what he believed. We need precision, he said, tapping a thick document against the table, his voice cutting clean through the low hum of whispered side conversations, and not everyone in this room is equipped for that. A few executives smirked, already sensing what was coming, already leaning into the familiar rhythm of power dynamics playing out in real time. Ethan's eyes landed on Clara, lingering just long enough to signal intent. You, he said, not even using her name, sliding the document across the glossy surface until it stopped in front of her. Take a look. The paper made a soft sound as it settled, louder than it should have in the sudden silence. Clara's fingers rested lightly on the edge, her posture straight but unassuming, the kind of composure that often gets mistaken for uncertainty. Go ahead, Ethan added, a faint smile forming. Read it. A pause, just long enough for the room to lean in. If you can. A ripple of restrained laughter moved through the executives, subtle but sharp, the kind meant to exclude, not include. Clara didn't immediately respond, her gaze dropped to the document, scanning the first page with a stillness that felt out of place, not nervous, not hesitant, just focused. And that was the first thing no one noticed, not the CFO adjusting his watch, not the senior partners exchanging knowing glances, and certainly not Ethan, who leaned back in his chair, already satisfied, already convinced the outcome was decided. This isn't entry-level material, he continued, his tone smooth, controlled, each word carefully placed to maintain the illusion of professionalism while delivering something far more pointed. We're discussing projections, risk modeling, structural integrity over a 12-month cycle. He gestured lightly toward the document. It requires a certain level of understanding. Clara turned a page slowly, the soft flick of paper echoing faintly, her expression unchanged, her eyes steady, absorbing more than anyone expected, but still, no one questioned it, because they had already decided who she was the moment she walked in, and decisions like that, in rooms like this, were rarely revisited. Well, Ethan pressed, the impatience beginning to surface beneath his polished exterior. Anything to add? Another pause, longer this time, the air tightening. Clara lifted her head, her eyes meeting his for the first time, calm, unwavering, and in that single moment, something shifted, something subtle but undeniable, because confidence like that didn't belong to someone who was supposed to fail. And yet, no one said a word, the room holding its breath without realizing it, as Clara gently closed the document, placed it back on the table, and stood up. And that's when the silence truly began. Clara stood there for a moment without speaking, and that silence began to stretch in a way that made people uncomfortable, not because it was loud, but because it was controlled, deliberate, and entirely hers, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the table as she glanced once more at the document before gently turning it back toward Ethan, the movement small but precise, as if she had already decided exactly how this would unfold. A senior executive shifted in his seat, another cleared his throat, the faint confidence that had filled the room just seconds earlier now beginning to thin. Well, Ethan repeated, his tone sharper this time, the hint of irritation slipping through the polished surface he worked so hard to maintain. But Clara did not rush, she did not react to the pressure. Instead she lifted her gaze again, steady and calm, and when she spoke, her voice was soft, but it carried clearly across the room. The assumptions in your third section are inconsistent with the projected growth rate, she said. And for a split second, no one moved, not because they did not hear her, but because they did not expect her to say anything at all. Ethan blinked once, just once, then leaned forward slightly, his expression tightening. Excuse me? He asked, a thin edge creeping into his voice. Clara did not hesitate now, she reached for the document again, flipping to a specific page with an ease that suggested familiarity rather than guesswork. Here, she continued, pointing to a line halfway down the page. You are projecting a 12% quarterly increase while simultaneously reducing operational capacity by 8%, her finger moved slightly, tracing the numbers. That creates a structural imbalance within the model. A murmur began to ripple across the table, quiet but undeniable, the kind of sound that forms when certainty begins to crack. Ethan's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing as he looked down at the page, then back at her, searching for hesitation, for uncertainty, for anything that would restore his control over the moment. But Clara remained composed, her posture unchanged, her presence no longer invisible. That is a simplification, Ethan said quickly, attempting to reclaim ground, but his voice lacked the ease it had carried before. Clara shook her head slightly, not dismissive, not aggressive, just certain. It is not a simplification, she replied, it is a contradiction. The word landed clean, sharp, and final, and suddenly the room felt smaller, tighter, the air heavier as eyes shifted between them. A partner on the left leaned forward, studying the document more closely. Another executive reached for his tablet, scrolling rapidly, verifying what she had just said. Clara turned another page. Her movement smooth, unhurried, and here, she added, your risk adjustment factor does not account for market volatility beyond a 6-month window. She looked up again, meeting Ethan's gaze directly, but your strategy depends on stability for at least 9. No one laughed this time, no one even attempted to. The earlier amusement had vanished completely, replaced by something far more unsettling, recognition. Ethan opened his mouth, then closed it again, the response he had prepared no longer fitting the reality unfolding in front of him. Clara placed the document back on the table, aligning it carefully, almost respectfully, as if the numbers themselves still deserved order even if the logic behind them did not. If implemented as written, she said, her voice still calm, still measured, this plan will begin to fail within 6 months. The words settled into the room like weight, pressing down on every polished surface, every confident expression, and for the first time since the meeting began, Ethan Caldwell had nothing to say, because the room was no longer his to control. No one moved, not immediately, because the weight of her words did not just challenge the model on the table, it challenged the certainty everyone in that room had been relying on, and certainty was something people at this level did not let go of easily. A senior partner leaned back slowly, fingers steepled under his chin as his eyes stayed locked on the numbers Clara had pointed out. Another executive adjusted his glasses, reading the same section again, this time more carefully, this time without assumption. The faint sound of scrolling and paper shifting replaced the earlier laughter, and in the center of it all stood Ethan Caldwell, still at the head of the table, but no longer in control of it. His jaw tightened as he flipped through the document, faster now, searching, not reading, looking for something to disprove her, something to anchor himself back into authority. But the deeper he went, the quieter he became, because the pattern she had exposed did not disappear, it expanded, line after line reinforcing the same flaw. This model was reviewed, he said finally, his voice lower, measured, but lacking its earlier sharpness, by 3 external analysts. Clara nodded slightly, acknowledging the statement without conceding to it. Then they missed it too, she replied, and that was when the room shifted again, not loudly, not dramatically, but undeniably, because her confidence was not arrogance, it was precision, and precision was difficult to argue with. The chief financial officer leaned forward now, tapping the table lightly as he spoke. If what she is saying is correct, he began, glancing between Ethan and the document, this affects our entire 4th quarter projection. Another voice followed, quieter but firm, and our investor briefing next month. The implications began to stack, each one heavier than the last. Clara remained still, not inserting herself further, not pushing, simply allowing the truth to settle where it needed to. Ethan exhaled slowly, a controlled breath, but one that carried the unmistakable weight of realization. He looked up at her again, this time differently, not as someone to dismiss, but as someone he had clearly underestimated. Where did you learn to analyze models like this? He asked, the question slipping out before he could stop it, and for a moment, the room seemed to lean in again, not out of curiosity this time, but out of something closer to respect. Clara did not answer immediately, her eyes drifting briefly to the window where the city stretched endlessly below, then back to the table. I read Them, she said simply, and the answer landed in a way no one expected, because it was not an explanation, it was a boundary, a quiet refusal to perform beyond what was necessary. A senior partner exchanged a glance with another, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. Ethan straightened slightly, his posture adjusting, recalibrating, but the shift had already happened, the dynamic had already changed. Because in a room built on perception and control, Clara had done something far more powerful than raising her voice or proving a point. She had exposed the truth with such clarity that it left no room for doubt, and as the silence settled once more, deeper now, heavier, it was no longer the silence of dismissal, but the silence of people realizing they had been looking at the wrong person all along. The silence did not break, it deepened, settling into the room like something permanent, something that could not be undone with a quick remark or a confident smile, and for the first time since the meeting began, no one was looking at Ethan Caldwell for direction. Their attention remained on the document, on the numbers, and on Clara Whitman, the woman who had just shifted the weight of the entire conversation without raising her voice. The chief financial officer leaned forward again, slower. This time, more deliberate. If we adjust the capacity variable to match the growth projection, he said carefully, almost testing the idea aloud, would the model stabilize? Clara did not rush to answer, her eyes moved back to the page, scanning briefly before she shook her head. Not without restructuring the risk allocation, she replied, her tone calm but certain. The volatility window is too narrow, it creates artificial stability in the first quarter, but it cannot sustain beyond that. Another executive nodded subtly, following her logic now, not questioning it, just absorbing it. The room had shifted from judgment to analysis, and that shift was irreversible. Ethan remained still for a moment longer, his fingers resting on the edge of the table, tapping once, then stopping, a habit he used when thinking, but this time it carried something different, not control, but recalibration. He looked down at the document again, slower now, actually reading it, line by line, as if seeing it for the first time, and the realization was not loud. It did not come with a visible reaction, but it settled into his posture, into the way his shoulders lowered slightly, into the way his next breath was longer than the last. How far does it go? He asked finally, his voice quieter, stripped of the earlier edge. Clara understood the question immediately, not where the error began, but how deep it ran. She turned the document back toward him, flipping 2 pages with a smooth motion. It starts here, she said, tapping a section near the middle, but it compounds here. Her finger moved again, further down, and by the time you reach your final projection, the entire structure depends on assumptions that no longer hold. The room listened closely, not interrupting, not challenging, just listening, because the authority had shifted, not through title, not through position, but through clarity. A senior partner exhaled slowly, leaning back as he processed the implications. We would need to delay the rollout, he said, almost to himself. Another voice followed, and revise the investor presentation. The consequences continued to unfold, each one reinforcing the same truth. This was not a minor oversight, it was a foundational flaw. Ethan closed the document gently, not with frustration, not with force, just with finality. He looked up at Clara again, and this time there was no trace of the earlier smirk, no hint of dismissal, only a quiet recognition that settled into the space between them. You saw all of that in under a minute, he said, not as a challenge, but as a statement. Clara met his gaze, steady as before. I saw enough, she replied, and the simplicity of that answer carried more weight than any explanation could, because it was not about speed, it was about understanding. The room remained still, no one eager to speak, no one willing to break the moment too quickly, because something fundamental had changed, not just in the plan they were discussing, but in how they viewed the person standing quietly at the end of the table. And as the city stretched endlessly beyond the glass walls, bright and indifferent, the people inside that room were beginning to understand that the smallest voice had just become the one they could not afford to ignore. The weight of the moment did not fade, it settled deeper, pressing into every person at that table as the implications of what had just happened continued to unfold. Not just a flawed model, not just a delayed rollout, but a complete shift in who held credibility in that room. And for a place built on hierarchy, that shift was impossible to ignore. The chief financial officer closed his tablet slowly, his expression no longer skeptical but focused. We need a revised model before the end of the week, he said, not looking at Ethan this time, but at Clara, and that subtle change did not go unnoticed. Another executive nodded in agreement, and the investor briefing cannot proceed with this structure. The conversation moved forward, but it no longer moved through Ethan, it moved around him, and that realization sat heavily in his chest. He straightened slightly, reclaiming what composure he could. But even he understood that something had changed that could not simply be corrected with authority. "We will reconvene tomorrow," he said, his voice steady again, though quieter than before, with adjustments. But even as he spoke, his eyes shifted briefly toward Clara, not commanding, not dismissing, but measuring, reassessing. The same room that had once reduced her to background noise now waited, almost unconsciously, for her response. Clara did not step forward again. She did not claim space that was not offered, instead she simply nodded once, acknowledging the direction without needing to reinforce it, because she had already done more than enough. A senior partner leaned toward her slightly, lowering his voice just enough to carry a different tone. "Would you be available to review the revisions?" he asked, and the question itself carried weight, not because of the request, but because of who it was directed to. Clara met his gaze calmly. "If needed," she replied, her answer measured. Neither eager nor reluctant, just certain. The room absorbed that quietly, and for a moment, no one spoke, because they all understood what had just been established. Value was no longer tied to title alone. Ethan finally closed the document fully, placing it in front of him with deliberate care, his fingers resting on it for a second longer than necessary, as if grounding himself in something solid. "Ms. Whitman," he said, using her name this time. And the shift in address was subtle but unmistakable. Clara looked at him, her expression unchanged. "Yes," she answered, and Ethan paused, just briefly, not out of hesitation, but because he was choosing his words more carefully than he had at any point earlier. "Thank you," he said, and the words were simple. But in that room, from that man, they carried more weight than any apology could. Clara gave a small nod, nothing more, not seeking recognition, not expanding the moment, just allowing it to exist as it was, and that was what made it final, because there was no performance left, no need to prove anything further. The truth had already done its work. One by one, the executives began gathering their materials. Quieter than before, more thoughtful, conversations reduced to low murmurs instead of confident declarations. The energy had shifted from dominance to reflection, and as Clara stepped back toward her seat, blending once again into the space she had occupied at the beginning, it was clear that she was no longer invisible, not to anyone in that room, and certainly not to Ethan Caldwell, who remained standing at the head of the table, watching her for just a moment longer than necessary. Because now he understood something he had missed before. The person he had tried to diminish was the one who had just prevented a mistake that could have cost them millions, and in that quiet realization, the room found a new kind of silence, not empty, not dismissive, but filled with something far more powerful: respect. The meeting did not end with noise or rushed conversation. It dissolved slowly, like something fragile that no one wanted to disturb. Chairs slid back with softened movements, papers were gathered with unusual care, and conversations that would normally fill the room were replaced by quiet exchanges, measured and thoughtful, as if everyone was recalibrating not just the strategy, but their understanding of the people around them. Clara Whitman remained near the end of the table, organizing a small stack of documents that were not even hers, her movements calm, unhurried, as if nothing significant had happened at all. Yet every glance in the room seemed to pass by her at least once before turning away, not out of curiosity anymore, but out of recognition, the kind that lingers even when no words are spoken. Across the room, Ethan Caldwell stood still for a moment longer than necessary, his hand resting lightly against the back of his chair, his gaze no longer scanning the room for control, but fixed briefly on Clara, as if trying to reconcile what he had just witnessed with everything he thought he knew. A senior partner approached him quietly, lowering his voice. "We were close to presenting that next week," he said, not accusatory, just factual. Ethan nodded once, his expression composed but thoughtful. "We were," he replied, and the weight of that statement did not need elaboration, because they both understood what had been avoided, not a small miscalculation, but something far more costly, both financially and reputationally. The partner glanced toward Clara, then back to Ethan. "She should be involved moving forward," he added, and again, there was no resistance, no immediate dismissal, just a brief pause before Ethan responded. "Yes," he said simply, and that single word marked a shift that would have been unthinkable an hour earlier. Clara finished arranging the documents and stepped back, her posture unchanged, her presence still. Quiet, but no longer overlooked. As she turned to leave the table, one of the executives who had laughed earlier hesitated before speaking. "Ms. Whitman," he said, his tone noticeably different now, more careful. "That was impressive." The word felt insufficient, and he seemed to realize it, but Clara did not react to the hesitation. She simply nodded politely. "Thank you," she replied, her voice even, without pride, without dismissal, just acknowledgement, and that simplicity carried more weight than any elaborate response could have. She moved toward the door, her steps steady against the marble floor, each one echoing faintly in the quiet room, and as she reached the threshold, the sunlight from the hallway spilling in, she paused briefly, not to look back, but as if giving the room a moment to settle fully into what had just occurred. Behind her, Ethan finally stepped forward, closing the distance by a few measured steps. "Ms. Whitman," he called, his voice firm but no longer sharp. Clara turned slightly, meeting his gaze without hesitation. "Yes," she answered, and for a brief second, the room seemed to hold its breath again, not out of tension this time, but anticipation. Ethan regarded her carefully, as if weighing not just his next words, but everything that had led to this moment. "You said the model fails in 6 months, he began, his tone controlled, deliberate. "How would you fix it?" And that question did not sound like a challenge, it sounded like something else entirely. Something closer to trust. Clara held his gaze, her expression calm, her eyes steady, and in that quiet exchange, it became clear that the balance of that room had shifted permanently. Because the man who once tried to test her was now asking to learn from her, and the silence that followed was no longer uncertain, it was expectant, waiting for her answer, knowing it would matter. Clara did not answer immediately, and that pause was not hesitation, it was calculation. The kind that came from someone who understood that words, once spoken in a room like this, would shape decisions far beyond that moment. Her eyes moved briefly back to the document still resting in Ethan's hands, then to the table, then back to him, steady and composed. "You do not fix it by adjusting numbers," she said finally, her voice calm but firm. "You fix it by changing the structure." The words landed differently than before, not as a correction, but as direction, and the room responded accordingly. No one interrupting, no one challenging, because they had already seen what happened when she spoke. Ethan held her gaze, his posture still, his expression attentive, no trace of the earlier arrogance remaining. "Explain," he said, and the word was simple, but it carried something new, openness. Clara stepped back toward the table, not reclaiming space, but entering it with quiet authority. Her fingers lightly touching the edge of the document as she turned it again, aligning it with precision. "Your model assumes stability as a baseline," she began, her tone even, each word deliberate, "but stability is not a constant, it is an outcome." A few executives exchanged glances, absorbing the shift in perspective. The chief financial officer leaned forward again, listening closely. Clara continued, "If you want the projection to hold, you need to build volatility into the foundation. Not treat it as an external variable." She pointed to a section on the page. "Her movements controlled, that means adjusting your capacity model to flex with demand instead of resisting it." The room remained silent, but it was no longer empty, it was engaged, focused, every person present following her logic step by step. Ethan's grip on the document loosened slightly, his attention fully on her now. "You are saying the entire framework needs to be redesigned," he said, not as an objection, but as confirmation. Clara nodded once. "Yes," she replied, "because right now, it is built to look stable, not to be stable." The distinction settled into the room with quiet weight. A senior partner exhaled slowly, leaning back as the realization took shape. "That changes the timeline," he said, more to himself than anyone else. Another executive added, "And the cost." Clara did not react to those concerns, she simply continued. "It also changes the outcome," she said, and that was what held the room in place, not the difficulty of the adjustment, but the clarity of the result. Ethan closed the document halfway, not shutting it down, but holding it as something unfinished, something that now required more than approval. "How long would it take?" he asked, his voice steady, focused. Clara considered for a brief moment, her expression unchanged. "If done correctly," she said, 2 weeks. A murmur moved through the room. Not resistance, but recalibration, timelines shifting. expectations. Adjusting, the chief financial officer nodded slowly. That is still ahead of the investor briefing, he said, and that detail mattered, because it meant the damage could be avoided. Ethan absorbed that quietly, then looked at Clara again, this time without any barrier between his position and her perspective. Then we do it your way, he said, and the words did not echo loudly, but they carried through the room with unmistakable clarity, because they marked a complete reversal of control, not forced, not dramatic, but earned. Clara did not react beyond a small nod, no satisfaction, no acknowledgement of victory, just acceptance of the decision, because for her, it was never about proving him wrong, it was about making the model right, and in that distinction, the room found a new center of gravity, one built not on hierarchy, but on understanding, and as the executives began quietly discussing next steps, their voices lower, more precise, it became clear that the woman who had once been invisible had now become the standard by which every decision in that room would be measured. The decision settled into the room with a quiet finality that no one attempted to challenge. Conversations began to shift from whether the model was flawed to how quickly it could be rebuilt. Laptops opened, notes were rewritten, and for the first time since the meeting had started, the energy was no longer driven by ego but by precision. Clara remained near the table, not at the center of the activity, but undeniably at the center of its direction, her presence steady, her posture unchanged. As if this level of influence was something she had never needed to announce, only to apply, the chief financial officer turned his screen slightly toward her. If we restructure the volatility window first, he said, his tone collaborative now, we can rebuild the capacity model on top of it. Clara glanced at the display, her eyes scanning quickly. Only if you decouple the baseline assumptions, she replied, her voice calm. Otherwise you are reinforcing the same flaw in a different form. The officer nodded immediately, adjusting his notes, not questioning, just adapting, and that silent acceptance spoke louder than any acknowledgement could. Across the table, a senior partner leaned toward another executive, speaking in a low voice. Who brought her in? He asked, not with suspicion, but with genuine curiosity. The other executive shook his head slightly. She is covering for administrative support, he answered, and the words seemed almost out of place now, because they no longer matched the reality unfolding in front of them. Ethan Caldwell stood at the head of the table, watching the shift with a composed expression, but inside, the recalibration was still happening, not just of the strategy, but of his own judgment. He had built his reputation on reading people quickly, accurately, decisively, and yet, in this case, he had been completely wrong, and that realization did not create defensiveness, it created something far more rare in that room, awareness. He stepped closer again, not to reclaim authority, but to participate in the direction that had already been set. We will need a working draft by Friday, he said, his voice steady, but now aligned with the flow of the room rather than controlling it. A few heads nodded, agreement forming quickly. Clara glanced at the timeline briefly, then back at the document. It can be done, she said, and there was no exaggeration in her tone, no attempt to impress, just a clear statement of feasibility. Ethan studied her for a moment, then asked, will you lead the revision? And the question carried weight, not because of the task itself, but because of what it represented, the transfer of trust, the acknowledgement of capability. The room grew quiet again, not tense, but attentive. Clara met his gaze. Her expression thoughtful for the first time, not uncertain, but considering, because this was no longer about correcting a mistake, it was about stepping into a role that would define what came next. I will guide it, she replied, choosing her words carefully, but the team needs to understand the structure, not just follow it. A few executives exchanged glances, recognizing the implication immediately. This was not someone who intended to control the process, but someone who intended to elevate it. Ethan nodded once, accepting the condition without hesitation. Then we will make sure they do, he said, and in that moment, the final shift was complete. The authority in the room had not disappeared, it had been refined, redirected, grounded in something stronger than hierarchy, and as the discussions continued, more focused now, more deliberate, it became clear that the quiet woman who had once been overlooked was no longer just part of the room, she was shaping it, and the silence that occasionally returned was no longer uncertain or tense. It was the kind that follows clarity, the kind that signals that everyone is finally seeing the same thing at the same time. The room no longer felt Like a place where decisions were imposed, it felt like a place where they were being rebuilt, piece by piece, and that difference was not loud, it was not dramatic, but it was unmistakable. Screens filled with revised frameworks, notes rewritten with more care, voices lowered not out of hesitation but out of focus, and at the center of it all, Clara Whitman stood quietly, guiding without dominating, correcting without diminishing, her presence steady like an anchor in a space that had been shifting too quickly before. The chief financial officer adjusted a variable on his model and turned the screen slightly toward her again. If we extend the volatility range to 9 months, he said, and redistribute the capacity load across 2 cycles, would that stabilize the projection? Clara leaned in slightly, her eyes scanning the new structure, her fingers resting lightly on the edge of the table as she processed the change. It would reduce the immediate risk, she replied, but it still assumes linear recovery. She tapped lightly near the middle of the screen. The market does not correct in straight lines, it fluctuates, and your model needs to reflect that. The officer nodded, making adjustments without pause, the confidence in her analysis now unquestioned. Across the table, another executive spoke up, his tone cautious but engaged. What if we build in a buffer at the 6-month mark? He suggested. A contingency layer to absorb unexpected variance. Clara considered the idea, her expression thoughtful. A buffer can help, she said, but only if it is dynamic, otherwise it becomes another static assumption that fails under pressure. The room absorbed that quietly, adapting again, refining, evolving, and with each adjustment, it became clearer that this was no longer about fixing a mistake, it was about building something stronger than what had been there before. Ethan Caldwell remained near the head of the table, but his role had changed, not diminished, but transformed. He was no longer directing every movement, he was listening, observing, stepping in only when necessary, his focus sharper now, his decisions more deliberate, and every so often, his eyes would shift toward Clara, not to measure her, but to understand her, to follow the logic that had reshaped the entire discussion. We are rebuilding from the foundation, he said at one point, his voice steady, aligning with the rhythm of the room, which means every assumption needs to be justified. A few executives nodded, recognizing the shift in standard. Clara glanced toward him briefly, acknowledging the alignment. And in that small exchange, there was something unspoken but clear. Respect, not declared, not performed, but present. The senior partner who had spoken earlier leaned forward again, his voice quieter now, almost reflective. We almost presented that model as it was, he said, more to himself than anyone else, the weight of that realization lingering. Clara did not respond to the statement, she did not need to, because the room already understood what it meant. The cost that had been avoided, the reputation that had been preserved, the trust that had not been broken, all because someone they had nearly ignored had chosen to speak. And as the discussion continued, more refined now, more precise, it became clear that the greatest shift in that room was not the model on the table, but the way every person present was now thinking, questioning more, assuming less, listening differently. And in that transformation, Clara Whitman remained exactly as she had been from the beginning, quiet, composed, and unmistakably certain, because she had never needed the room to see her value, she had only needed the moment to reveal it. The discussion did not slow down, it sharpened, every voice now carrying intention instead of assumption, every suggestion tested against a standard that had only just been established, and that standard was no longer invisible. It stood quietly at the edge of the table, watching, refining, correcting. Clara Whitman did not move much, she did not need to. Because the room had begun to move around her understanding rather than past it. The chief financial officer adjusted another variable and paused, this time not speaking immediately, his eyes scanning the model with a level of scrutiny that had not been there before. If we simulate irregular recovery intervals, he said slowly, thinking through each word, we might capture the fluctuations more realistically. Clara nodded once. Yes, she replied, but only if your input data reflects real volatility, not averaged projections. She glanced briefly at his screen. Averaging removes the very risk you are trying to measure. The officer exhaled lightly, almost a quiet acknowledgement of the depth of that correction, and made the change without hesitation. Across the table, another executive leaned forward, his voice more measured than earlier. We should pull live market data instead of relying on last quarter summaries, he suggested, and this time, no one dismissed the idea as impractical, because practicality had been redefined in that room. Clara gave a slight nod. That would align the model with current behavior, she said, and again, the adjustment was immediate, efficient. Accepted. Ethan Caldwell watched the process unfold with a level of focus. That was different from before. It was no longer about leading the conversation, it was about understanding the rhythm of it, the way each correction built on the last, the way clarity replaced assumption step by step. He stepped closer to the table again, resting his hand lightly against the edge as he looked down at the evolving model. "We are no longer correcting errors," he said, his voice steady. "We are redefining the framework," and that statement did not sound like an assertion of authority, it sounded like recognition. Clara glanced at him briefly, then back to the document. "That is the only way it holds," she replied, and the simplicity of her words reinforced the complexity of what they were doing. A senior partner who had remained quiet for several minutes finally spoke, his tone reflective. "We built the original model to meet expectations," he said, almost as if admitting something to himself, not to withstand reality. The room absorbed that in silence, because it was not just about the model anymore, it was about how decisions had been made before, how assumptions had been allowed to stand without being tested. Clara did not respond to the statement, she did not need to, because her presence alone had already challenged that pattern. Ethan straightened slightly, his posture composed, but his perspective clearly altered. "From now on," he said, his voice calm but firm, "every model we approve will be stress-tested under real conditions before it moves forward." There was no objection, no hesitation, only quiet agreement, because everyone in that room understood the cost of not doing so. Clara reached for the document once more, aligning the pages carefully. Her movements precise as always, and as she stepped back again, the room did not return to its previous state, it did not fall back into old habits, instead it held on to the clarity that had been introduced, because once seen, it could not be ignored, and as the city outside continued its endless motion, indifferent to what had just changed inside that glass room, the people within it were no longer operating the same way, not because they had been told to, but because they had been shown how. And at the center of that shift stood the quiet woman who had never needed to claim authority to redefine it. By the time the final adjustments began to take shape, the room had transformed into something almost unrecognizable from where it had started, not because the people had changed, but because the way they were thinking had. Every assumption now questioned, every projection tested, every voice measured against clarity rather than confidence. Clara Whitman stood slightly apart from the center, not removed, but no longer needing to insert herself into every exchange, because the system she had introduced was now sustaining itself. The chief financial officer reviewed the latest iteration of the model, his eyes moving carefully across the data, then back again, slower this time. "This holds under variable conditions," he said quietly, almost as if confirming it to himself. Then he looked up, not at Ethan, but at Clara. "It actually holds," and there was something in his tone that had not been there before. Not just approval, but respect earned through understanding. Across the table, another executive leaned back, exhaling slowly. "We would not have caught this," he admitted, his voice low, and no one rushed to disagree, because the truth of that statement was evident. It did not need reinforcement. Ethan Caldwell remained at the head of the table, his posture steady, but his presence now aligned with the room rather than above it. His eyes moved from the model to Clara, then back again, and for a moment, he said nothing, not because he had nothing to say, but because he understood that speaking too quickly would break something that had taken time to build. "Prepare this version for internal review," he said finally, his tone controlled, but no longer rigid, "and schedule a follow-up before the investor briefing." A few executives nodded, already making notes, the process continuing with a new level of precision. Clara turned slightly, organizing the remaining documents with the same quiet efficiency she had shown from the beginning, her role still undefined by title, but clearly established by impact. As she stepped back from the table, one of the senior partners approached her, his voice lowered out of respect rather than secrecy. "You have done this before," he said, not as a question, but as a realization forming in real time. Clara paused, her expression calm, her eyes steady. "I have seen models like this before," she replied, and the answer was simple, but it carried layers that no one in the room could fully see yet. The partner studied her for a moment longer, then nodded, accepting that there was more beneath the surface than what had been revealed. Across the room, Ethan took a step forward, closing the distance once more, not with urgency, but with intention. "Ms. Whitman," he said, his voice measured, and when she turned to face him, the room seemed to quiet again, not out of tension, but anticipation, because every exchange between them now carried weight. Once this is complete, he continued, I would like to understand your process. The request was direct. But it was no longer a test, it was an invitation. Clara met his gaze without hesitation, her expression thoughtful, not guarded, but not fully open either. It is not a process, she said after a brief pause, it is a perspective, and that distinction lingered in the air, because it suggested something deeper than skill, something that could not simply be taught or replicated. Ethan absorbed that quietly, his expression unchanged, but his understanding clearly evolving, and as the meeting finally began to dissolve into its closing moments, the room did not return to its previous rhythm, it did not fill with casual conversation or confident declarations. Instead, it held on to the clarity that had been established, because once a standard like that is introduced, it does not disappear, it becomes the measure for everything that follows, and in that space, Clara Whitman remained exactly where she had always been, quiet, composed, and no longer underestimated, because the room had learned something it would not forget, that the greatest shifts do not come from the loudest voices, but from the ones that see what others overlook, and choose to speak only when it matters most. The room did not erupt into applause, it did not fill with congratulations or dramatic reactions, instead it settled into something far more lasting, a quiet recognition that lingered in every movement, every glance, every decision that followed, the kind of shift that does not need to be announced because it is already understood. Clara Whitman gathered the last of the documents with the same calm precision she had shown from the beginning, aligning each page as if the smallest detail still mattered, even after everything that had just unfolded. And perhaps they did, because in a room where millions of dollars could turn on a single overlooked line, precision was not a preference, it was a necessity. The executives moved more slowly now, their conversations quieter, more deliberate, as if each of them was carrying away not just a revised model, but a revised way of thinking. Across the table, the chief financial officer closed his laptop and looked at Clara once more, not with curiosity, but with something closer to certainty. We will get this right, he said, and the statement was no longer driven by confidence alone, it was grounded in understanding. Clara nodded slightly, acknowledging the intention without needing to reinforce it, because the room no longer required validation, it required execution. Ethan Caldwell remained where he stood, his posture composed, but his presence changed in a way that could not be reversed. The authority he held was no longer built on assumption, it was now shaped by awareness, and that awareness carried weight. He looked at Clara again, not as someone who had disrupted his process, but as someone who had refined it. You said it is a perspective, he said, his voice steady, one that most people in this room did not have. Clara met his gaze, her expression calm, her eyes steady as always. Most people do not need to have it, she replied, and her words were not dismissive, they were precise, they just need to be willing to see when it is missing. The statement settled into the space between them, quiet but undeniable, because it shifted responsibility from knowledge to awareness, from expertise to openness. Ethan absorbed that without response, because there was nothing to argue, nothing to correct, only something to carry forward. A senior partner nearby nodded almost imperceptibly, as if confirming the same realization within himself. The meeting had not just been about numbers or projections, it had been about the cost of overlooking the wrong voice. Clara stepped away from the table then, her movements unhurried, her role complete without ever being formally defined. As she moved toward the door, the sunlight catching briefly on the edge of the glass walls, she did not look back, she did not wait for acknowledgement, because she had never needed it to begin with. Behind her, the room remained still for a moment longer than necessary, not out of hesitation, but reflection, because each person present understood that something had just shifted in a way that would not easily fade. And as Ethan finally turned back toward the table, his gaze resting briefly on the revised model before him, there was a quiet clarity in his expression, not just about the work ahead, but about the moment that had led them there, because sometimes the most important change does not come from what is added, but from what is finally seen. And in that realization, the room found its new standard, one that would not be measured by titles or voices, but by the willingness to question what everyone else assumes to be true. The hallway outside the boardroom was quieter than usual, the kind of quiet that follows a moment people know they will remember, even if they never speak about it again. Clara Whitman walked forward at the same steady pace she had entered with, her steps light against the polished floor, her posture unchanged, as if nothing in her world had shifted at all, but behind her, inside that glass room, everything had. Ethan Caldwell remained standing for a moment longer after the others had begun to leave, his hand resting lightly on the back of his chair, his eyes fixed not on the skyline beyond the windows, but on the reflection in the glass, a reflection that now included something he had not seen before, not just the image of a leader, but the outline of a mistake he had nearly allowed to pass unchecked. He turned back toward the table slowly, the revised model still open, numbers aligned differently now, assumptions rebuilt. The structure stronger not because it had been defended, but because it had been challenged, and that distinction mattered more than anything else. The chief financial officer paused near the door, glancing back once. "We will circulate the updated version tonight," he said, his voice calm, grounded. Ethan nodded without looking up. "Make sure it is stress-tested under multiple scenarios," he replied, and this time, the instruction did not come from habit, it came from understanding. One by one, the executives stepped out, their conversations quieter, more thoughtful, each carrying with them the same realization, that clarity does not always come from authority, and authority does not always recognize clarity until it is forced to. The door closed softly behind the last of them, leaving Ethan alone for a brief moment, the room no longer filled with voices, only the faint hum of the city below. He exhaled slowly, then reached for the document, flipping through the pages again, not searching this time, but reading, truly reading, as if each line now carried a weight it had not held before, and in that quiet, he saw it again, not the flaw, but the moment it had been revealed, the calm voice, the steady gaze, the certainty that had not needed to raise itself to be heard. Clara Whitman had not challenged him, she had shown him, and that difference lingered longer than any argument could. Outside, Clara reached the elevator, pressing the button with the same quiet precision she applied to everything else. She did not check her reflection, did not adjust her appearance, because she had never relied on it.